what does the policeman say to their belly button? You are under a vest. So I figured this is somehow appropriate for this audience. Okay, so now let's really now talk about auctions. So why? Why would it make sense to look at auctions? Well, because there's a lot of money in them. And eBay shareholder reports, millions of pounds turnover monthly. And no one will tell you exactly how much money is lost to fraud, because they tend to be secretive about that. But you can read any number of advisories on how to protect yourself. So it must be a big deal. But still, why would it make sense to look at auction fraud from a psychological perspective? I mean, there are mechanical solutions, right? So it would make sense because there's a number of psychological mechanisms in play in any kind of consumerism, in any kind of purchase. For instance, attitudes towards possessions, so the idea that what you own is your extended self. There are demand characteristics of money, so what people psychologically expect from the amounts they own, from their personal utility. There are risk preferences. People might enjoy some thrill-seekings, and there would be sensation-seeking and so on in purchasing, getting something new and so on. And specifically in auctions, there are also some psychological mechanisms in play. I mean, I'm just talking about subsets here, right? There's optimism bias. We tend to believe that things will turn out better than they actually do. Most of us believe that. In general, there's hedonic shopping. People feel a void by shopping, and in auctions, that's you can do a lot of buying for very small amounts, and you kind of appease yourself. There's sensation seeking, the thrill of the chase. You bid, and there's somebody is bidding against you, so there's like a competition. And because the potential victims play an active role in the decision making, okay, so there's victim facilitation. I mean, if you look at internet fraud in general, there are situations where you basically, have no say or almost no control. So if you visit a web page and some software is downloaded from that web page without you clicking anything, any intervention, it doesn't really, matter what kind of a personality makeup you are. Things are happening, beyond your control. But in auctions, you have to facilitate. You have to bid. You have to decide that this is an item you want. So it makes sense to look at, what kind of people bid and, what are the mechanisms employed. So there were initial postulates that we had to make, or that we usually, make in this kind of research. So we postulated that scam compliance, falling for scams, is a three-stage process, right? So first, you have to find something believable. You have to say to yourself, well, I've received this email. I mean, this could be a real thing. This could probably work. Then you have to respond to it. And at that point in time, you already lose some, perhaps some private information, but it's not the real loss yet. And then you lose utility. The other thing that we postulated is that fraud is an illegal marketing offer. So in other words, in fraud, same rules apply as in advertising. So, and that has been proven again and again and again in research. And then we postulated that, compliance across different categories of internet fraud is influenced by different mechanisms, which kind of makes sense. So in order to believe something, you perhaps have to be more imaginative, and so on. In order to respond, there are other triggers. And we postulated victim facilitation, so something that I talked about already. So you have to be an active participant. And then we ask these questions. So what are the psychological mechanisms of persuasion that influence your compliance with fraud? What are the particulars of fraudulent auctions? What items are specifically prone to be used in scams? How much money is lost? What do people do, after the money was lost, if it was So we're kind of interested in 3 stages, in essence. What happens before the actual fraud taking place? So are there any things that people pay special attention to? When they look at listings, what is the trigger? Then we looked at what specifically happens. Is it like if it's an eBay auction, does the item not get delivered? Is it a wrong item? Is there just no response, and so on? And then we were looking at what happens afterwards. So do people give negative feedback? Do they open a dispute? Do they recover their funds? And then we asked ourselves, so are there any differences in psychological traits between those people who respond but stop and those people who actually lose money? So there were 2 experiments. There was one study that was advertised online by the BBC, a fairly huge sample size. And we looked at scam compliance with auction fraud. So across 4 levels, so not compliant, found it plausible, responded, or lost. And we used an in-house developed scale of susceptibility to persuasion 2. So this is 54 items, 10 subdomains, and then further 6 subdomains. And it measures different mechanisms of persuasion, coming from postulates of behavioral economics and social psychology of persuasion. And the second experiment, we did a follow-up study on those people who actually told us in the first study that they have fallen victims of auction fraud. And we asked them to participate some more. We contacted about 280 people. 81 actually responded. Well, about 115 responded, but 81 is the numerous of those who actually responded, in full. We used Hexaco personality scale. We used impulsive behavior scale, and we used Sophie van der Zees and colleagues' deceptiveness scale. And we ran logistic regressions on that. So results, as far as auction fraud compliance rates in general, well, these are the compliance rates of auction fraud. So about 60% of people find auctions plausible. About a very small amount, as you see, like 1.2% respond but not lose any money, and about 5% lost in our sample. Overall compliance rates, because we were asking about all kinds of different types of fraud in that particular experiment. So not compliant people, about 52% were completely non-compliant, but 94% of people actually found at least one of the 9 scenarios that we presented them with as plausible. So in essence, we said, okay, so here are 9 situations. We'll describe them in 1 sentence. Tell us how plausible on a scale of 1 to 7 do you think they are? 1 is like completely not believable. This is obviously a scam. To 7, oh, this could really work. And 94.8, 95% of people actually in at least one scenario said, oh, scored more than 3.5. So more than average. So found it plausible to a certain extent. About 26% of people actually responded to one of the scams, one of the fraud types that we described there. And about 22 actually lost utility. So there's a slight, well, not the discrepancy. I mean, this is what the data tells you. But generally, what you find is that, losing utility is a fairly low probability event. This is quite high. Obviously, this is self-reported. But still, usually you get like, 3 to 5% of population loses utility. So I won't really go into, I'll explain this. I don't want to overwhelm you with numbers. But you can clearly see that there is a difference. Okay. So you can clearly see that there is a difference between categories. There's a whole bunch of stuff that influences plausibility. There's a bit of stuff that influences responded and then lost again. So for instance, and you can see that different mechanisms influence different stages of compliance. I'll talk about this, not in a table form. So as far as the second experiment is concerned, so most respondents, almost all, were willing to tell us what they bought in a fake auction. So that's kind of interesting, and we like that. But the items range just wildly, from nappies to condominiums. I mean, there are actually people who buy apartments on eBay, which is interesting. And none of them repeated themselves. So we couldn't really do any kind of real item analysis. I mean, it's just all over the place. I mean, the sample size is obviously small, and if we get more people, then perhaps it's right now. So there were red flags. So we asked people, so when you looked at the auction, what are the kind of things that you paid attention to? Did you pay attention to this, or this? And the highest scoring category was people paid attention to the description of the item. Okay, this was 61%. They just read description very carefully. Then the price of the item, how much it costs. Then depictions of the item, so photographs. The condition of the item, is it new, is it used, and so on. And then feedback score of the seller. And all other considerations, there were about 17, were below 40%. Approximately 50% of the respondents in general think that feedback is really important. So the amount invested into purchase was very skewed, so we relativized this because it really, it depends on the purchasing power of the individual. So if there's a millionaire, I mean, to them, the relative financial impact would be different if they lost £1,000 to a person who's, perhaps on the dole. So we just said, regarding, how many percent of your monthly income was the purchase worth? Okay? So in 60% of the cases, respondents used less than 1% of their monthly income. And only 4% of respondents actually invested several times their monthly income. This is the condominium buyers. So, and then we asked, did you open up a dispute? Did you want to get your money back? And only 26% of our respondents attempted to recover their funds. And out of this 26%, approximately 50% got their money back. About 2/3 got back everything, and about 1/3, got everything sans the postage and packing costs. And then we looked at personality traits, and I won't dwell on this, but I'll go into detail just in the discussion. But there are things that are salient, both in Hexaco and the UPPS IBS, so the impulsivity scale. So, discussion. So in the study one, so the decision to find an auction believable is influenced by many different persuasive mechanisms. So for instance, need for consistency, need for uniqueness, sensation seeking, social influence, attitudes towards risk, and others. So this is not surprising. So individuals, we work very hard to believe stuff, right? So if we think that something is a good deal, then we work against ourselves, and we just find ways to believe that this could actually work. This is plausible, right? Because it's such a good deal that it could not, be not plausible. So we work against ourselves in a way. So, generally we could say individuals who feel no need for consistency and are not very good at trying to find explanations for events are more likely to believe scammers. So a believer will also be more susceptible to in-group pressures and will be looking to experience new things. So responding or bidding in a fraudulent auction is another matter. There are three significant regressors, so need for uniqueness, so you're looking for new and unique stuff, sensation seeking, so the thrill of the bid, there are the stakes, you're competing against someone, and then risk seeking attitude. So you're kind of laissez-faire about ethics, about finances, you take bigger risks, so you're more likely to bid. And then in losing, so going from responding to losing money, again, there are three regressors. So attitude towards advertising, interestingly, and it's a negative regressor. So the less you think about advertising, or the more negative you are towards it, the more likely you are to fall for, to lose money in an auction. Need for uniqueness, again, if it's a unique item, you really want to win it. And social influence, normative. So you're probably familiar with the idea of social influence being like two-pronged. There's the informative side and the normative side. Informative side is you ask your friend for advice on a purchase, let's say, and they give you an informed answer. So this is part of your in-group, so they're your friends, they have influence, but they give you information, and you decide. Social influence normative means that somebody says, you see, everybody in our group is doing this, so you'll be doing it too, okay? And you go with it. So in a sense, normative social influence is more coercive. So there are very few people who make contact with the seller or start bidding on an item who do not go through with the transaction. So in essence, almost everyone who responds to scammers in auctions or bids doesn't bow out, okay? And we thought about why could this be. So is this need for commitment? So once you've started, you have to follow through. Or is it sunk cost fallacy? You think, well, I've already invested some time, money, effort, so I have to finish because otherwise I'll just get nothing. And those who are looking for unique deals and enjoy the thrill of the chase transact more and are more likely to be victimized. So then I thought, oh, so basically what I'm looking at is actually the psychological mechanisms that show, the frequency. So that, who are the people who actually bid more? And, by default, these are the people who will be more likely to lose at some point in time. Okay, so, but then, it shows, our study shows that about 60% of the victims were fairly new users. So this is not the case. It's not the case that if you actually go and, if you're a very frequent visitor, that those mechanisms would come in play. These are actually the mechanisms that define you losing. Okay, so I'll just really rush through. So previous research showed that feedback score and spelling were salient. In this case, people were interested somewhat in feedback, but not that much, and they were not interested in spelling or grammar errors in auctions at all. There's no temporal effects, so basically people don't care if the auction is ending soon, and scarcity didn't have a large effect. So people didn't check whether there were more items on offer. There are a number of personality traits statistically significant in determining whether an individual will progress from responding to losing. So the deceptiveness scale yielded no significant regressors, but this is not surprising because I would assume that deceptiveness scale, which measures propensity for truthfulness or propensity for deceptiveness, this would be, I think, possibly would work in plausibility, not in the time when you change from responding to losing. So I think that's probably the case. No full hexacodomains were salient, but 5 out of 6 hexacodomains had like subdomains that were statistically very significant. Yeah, okay, sorry. And so on. Thank you for listening.